The storm had been chasing Route 40 since Amarillo, and by the time it caught the Rainbelt Diner it had turned the parking lot into a shallow black lake, stitched with the reflections of a buzzing neon sign that had been missing its apostrophe since before anyone working there had been born. Inside, the air smelled like fryer oil, burnt coffee, and wet vinyl. It was 11:40 on a Thursday night, the hour that belonged to long-haul drivers, third-shift nurses coming off a double, and the occasional lost soul who didn't and oppose. Want to go home yet? In the corner booth, back to the wall facing the door, sat Renata Cruz. She was 51, though the fine lines around her eyes made her look like a woman who and oppose. Spent decades reading terrain instead of birthdays, squinting into desert glare, sandstorms, and the green wash of night vision optics. She wore a faded canvas jacket over a thermal shirt, jeans gone soft with wear, and boots that had been resoled twice. Her dark hair, threaded with gray, was pulled back in a simple braid. On the table sat a paperback with a cracked spine, a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, and a set of keys attached to a small enamel pin shaped like a trident, the only piece of her old life she still carried in plain sight, and the only piece nobody in a diner ever recognized for what it was. To the room, Renata looked like exactly what she appeared to be. A trucker stopping for coffee before a night haul. Nobody in the Rainbelt Diner would have guessed that 50 pounds of muscle memory in her shoulders had once carried men out of burning buildings in Ramadi, that her hands had once been trained by the Marine Corps and oppos, most exacting hand-to-hand instructors, and had then gone on to train others, or that for 6 years she had run point on some of the ugliest close quarters work and force reconnaissance before quietly retiring into a life she and oppos, chosen specifically because nothing in it would ever ask her to hurt anyone again. She liked the diner. She liked the rain. She liked being nobody. The bell over the door jangled hard enough to rattle the glass. 3 men came in laughing too loud for the hour, the particular performative loudness of people who wanted the room to notice them. At the front was Cole Whitfield, 29, 6'1", moving with the loose-jointed swagger of someone who had never once doubted his own physical superiority in a room. He had a fresh cut over one eyebrow, still shining with antibiotic ointment, and the kind of build that came from a decade of disciplined violence. Undefeated in the cage, 14-0, the face of Whitfield MMA and AMP. Fitness, a gym he and oppos. Built from nothing into the biggest name in 3 counties. Behind him came Tyler and Marcus, his training partners and more accurately, his audience. End quote. And I told him if he shoots that leg again I and oppos, I'm gonna snap it like a breadstick, end quote. Cole was saying, dropping his gym bag onto the counter with a wet slap that sent water flying. End quote. Man and oppos, got 0 head movement. 0, end quote. The bag and oppos, momentum carried it another foot, clipping the edge of Renata and oppos, booth and knocking her mug over. Hot coffee sheeted across the table, soaking the corner of her paperback and running off the edge onto her jeans. The diner went quiet except for the hiss of the grill. Renata didn't and oppos flinch. She pulled her hand back from the spreading coffee, picked up the book, and shook it once before setting it aside. She reached for napkins and began, without hurry, to blot the table dry. Cole glanced over, clocked the spill and grinned, the wide, easy grin of a man who had learned a long time ago that charm covered for almost anything. End quote. My bad, end quote. He said in the tone of someone who did not mean it. End quote. You gotta watch the splash zone, sweetheart. End quote. Renata didn't and oppos. Look up. End quote. It and oppos fine. Just mind your bag next time. End quote. Her voice was even. Low. Entirely without heat, which was to Cole somehow more irritating than if she and oppos snapped at him. He was used to a certain reaction from strangers. A flicker of recognition, a little deference, maybe a nervous compliment about his last fight. What he was not used to was being dismissed by a woman in a trucker and oppos jacket who hadn't and oppos even bothered to look at his face. End quote. Sweetheart, end quote. He repeated, testing the word like it had offended him on her behalf. He took a step toward the booth. End quote. You want to try that again? With eye contact this time. End quote. The waitress, a heavy-set woman in her 60s named Deb, whose name tag had been safety pinned on since Reagan and oppos second term, started toward them, wiping her hands on her apron. End quote. Cole C and oppos, ma now let me get you boys a table, end quote. End quote. I got this, Deb, end quote. Cole said, not taking his eyes off Renata. Renata finished wiping the table, folded the wet napkins into a neat square, and set them on her plate. Only then did she lift her eyes to his. They were dark brown and there was nothing in them. Not fear. Not anger. Just a flat, assessing calm, the look of someone doing quiet math on distance and angles, the way you and Oppos glance at weather before deciding whether to bring an umbrella. And quote, I don't and Oppos. Want any trouble and quote, she said. And quote, I and Oppos we got a load to run tonight. I and Oppos am going to pay my check and go. And quote. She slid a 20 onto the table, more than enough for the coffee and a heavy tip for Deb, picked up her ruined paperback and stood. She was not a small woman, but standing next to Cole she looked almost delicate, and something about that gap between what she looked like and what she actually was would have been visible to anyone paying real attention. Nobody in the diner was paying that kind of attention. Not yet. And quote, hey. I didn't and Oppos say we were done and quote, Cole said, and there was an edge under the charm now, thin and ugly. Renata didn't and Oppos answer. She walked past him, pushed open the glass door and stepped out into the storm. For 1 second, Cole stood there in front of his friends, in front of Deb, in front of the whole quiet diner, looking like exactly what he was afraid of looking like. A man who and Oppos just been walked away from. And quote, let it go man and quote, Marcus muttered. And quote, she and Oppos just some trucker. And quote. And quote, nobody walks off on me and quote, Cole said, and the words came out thin, almost embarrassed, as if some part of him already knew how small they sounded. He shoved the door open and went out after her. The parking lot was a wide sheet of cracked asphalt, chewed up by years of 18-wheelers and pooling now under sodium lights that turned the rain gold. Renata was halfway to her rig, a dark green Kenworth with steel piping loaded for a Lubbock delivery, boots splashing rhythmically, her mind already on the 400 miles ahead of her. And quote, hey, trucker. And quote. She stopped, closed her eyes for one breath the way she used to before a breach, not because she was afraid, but because she was giving her body permission to shift gears, and she never did that lightly anymore. When she and Oppos left the Corps, she and Oppos made herself a promise, one she and Oppos kept for 11 years. She would not go looking for a fight, and she would not let a fight find her without giving it every chance to walk away first. She turned around. Cole was closing the distance fast, rain slicking his shirt to his chest, Tyler and Marcus hanging back under the diner awning with the uneasy stillness of men who sensed, without being able to say why, that something about tonight had gone sideways from the script they knew. And quote, you embarrassed me in there and quote, Cole said. And quote, you spilled my coffee and quote, Renata said. And quote, I didn't and Oppos do anything to you and quote. And quote, you walked away from me like I was nothing. And quote. And there it was, the actual wound laid bare in 4 words, more honest than anything he and Oppos said in the diner. Not the coffee. Not the end quote, sweetheart end quote, the unbearable experience for a man who had built his entire identity on being looked at, of being looked past. Renata studied him for a second in the rain. She had seen this particular kind of hunger before, in much more dangerous men, in places far from a Texas parking lot, the hunger to be feared because being ignored felt like dying. She almost felt sorry for him. And quote, go back inside and quote, she said not unkindly. And quote, eat your steak. This ISN and Oppos a story you want to be in. And quote. And quote, I and Oppos am going to put you on the ground and quote, Cole said and threw the punch. It was, by every technical measure, a beautiful shot. A tight left hook, hips fully rotated, the kind of punch that had ended 3 professional fights in the last 2 years. It would have put most people on the concrete before they registered it had been thrown. Renata wasn't an Oppos there when it landed. To a cage fighter, violence is a sport with a referee, a bell, a doctor at ringside, for ounce gloves and an opponent who has agreed in writing to be hit. To someone trained the way Renata had been trained, a fist coming at your head in a parking lot at midnight is not a contest. It and Oppos a problem to be solved in under a second, using the smallest possible amount of force required to make it stop. She stepped inside the arc of the punch instead of away from it, catching his forearm and redirecting it past her shoulder, and in the same motion dropped her weight and drove the heel of her boot into the side of his front knee. Not hard enough to tear anything, just hard enough to take his base away on ground that was already slick with rain. Cole went down hard, face first into a puddle, the water splashing up around him in the gold light. Under the awning, Tyler and Marcus went completely silent. Cole came up spitting muddy water, humiliated in a way that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with the sheer physics of what had just happened to him. A woman a head shorter than him, 20 years older, had made him fall down without visibly trying. He didn't an oppose, think. He lunged for a double-leg takedown, the one technique that had never once failed him, the one that had put opponent after opponent on their back, where his real advantage, top control, ground and pound, the relentless grinding weight of him, could finally come to bear. Renata pivoted off the line, let him sail past her into empty air, and brought her forearm down across the back of his neck as he passed, dropping him flat onto the asphalt with the wind driven out of him in one ragged cough. She put a knee in the center of his back before he could recover, took his wrist and applied just enough pressure to make the shoulder joint understand, immediately and completely, exactly how little effort it would take to end his career permanently. End quote. Listen to me, end quote, she said quietly, close to his ear, her breathing perfectly even. End quote. In the cage, someone stops this when you tap. Out here, there and oppose. No one to stop it but me. If you try to get up before I and oppose, in my truck, I dislocate this shoulder and you never throw a punch again. Not if you understand. End quote. Cole, shaking, humiliated, terrified in a way he had never once been terrified inside a cage with padded floors and a referee 2 feet away, nodded. Renata held the lock 2 seconds longer than she needed to, not out of cruelty, but because she and oppose learned a long time ago that the 2 seconds mattered more than the first 10, that they were the difference between a lesson and an escalation, then released him, stood and walked to her truck without looking back. She pulled out onto Route 40 at 12:04 a.m., and by the time the diner and oppo's neon sign had shrunk to a red smear in her mirror, she had already mostly let it go. Cole did not. For 3 days Cole didn't an oppo's train. It wasn't an oppo's the knee was fine, just bruised. It wasn't an oppo's even really the fall, though the fall replayed on a loop every time he closed his eyes. It was the 2 seconds at the end, kneeling in the mud with his shoulder one small movement from destruction, understanding for the first time in his adult life what it actually felt like to be completely, utterly at someone else and oppo's mercy. He told himself it was a fluke. Wet pavement. A lucky angle. He told himself this so many times that by the 3rd day he half believed it, and the half that didn't and oppose believe it was the half that scared him more than the woman had. Tyler and Marcus hadn't and oppose told anyone at the gym. Cole had made that very clear, in a tone neither of them wanted to test twice. But something had shifted in how they looked at him. A new carefulness, the kind you extend to something you and oppose not sure one and oppose break. He needed the fluke to be a fluke. And the only way to prove that in his mind was to find her again on ground that wasn't and oppose slick without an audience of 2, and settle it the way a real fight was supposed to be settled. His cousin Raina worked dispatch for a regional freight broker out of Midland. It took Cole 4 days of leaning on her, favors called in from a childhood she still felt guilty about, a birthday she and oppose missed, a debt he was careful to phrase as smaller than it was, before she pulled the load manifest tied to a Kenworth registered to an independent owner-operator named Renata Cruz, scheduled for a Thursday night steel delivery at a yard outside Lubbock. End quote. Why do you need this? End quote. Raina asked, already regretting it. End quote. Don and oppose worry about it, end quote. Cole said. What none of them, not Raina, not Tyler, not Marcus, not even Cole himself in the version of the story he was telling himself, accounted for was how far the need to prove something to yourself can travel past the point where it and oppose still just about pride. By Thursday, end quote, settling it, end quote, had quietly become something closer to an ambush, and none of the 3 men in the truck that night said the word out loud, because saying it would have made it real. The industrial stretch outside Lubbock had no streetlights, no cameras, and at 1:15 in the morning, no witnesses. Cole and oppose black Ford Raptor sat idling in the dark with its lights off, parked in the shadow of an abandoned loading dock. End quote. I don and oppose like this, end quote. Marcus said from the backseat, watching the empty road. End quote. She didn't end oppose. T fight like a normal person. There was something off about the way she moved. End quote. End quote. She got lucky. Tonight there and oppose. No rain. End quote. Cole said, though his hands were tight on the wheel in a way that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as them. End quote. Tonight she doesn't and oppose. T walk away. End quote. At 1:15, the deep rumble of a diesel engine broke the stillness. Renata and oppose. Kenworth swept its headlights across the lot as it turned toward the yard gates. Cole gunned the Raptor out of the shadows and cut across her path, forcing her to stand on the air brakes. The Kenworth hissed to a stop, nose to nose with the pickup. Inside the cab, Renata sat still for a long moment before she reached over and killed the engine. She recognized the truck. She recognized when he stepped out into her headlights with Tyler and Marcus flanking him, the young man from the diner, moving a little stiffly, flashlights gripped in his friends and oppose. Hands like the weapons they and oppose. Dee decided somewhere on the drive out they might actually need to use. Something in Renata went very quiet and very still. Not fear, but the old familiar recalibration she hadn't and oppose. T had to make in over a decade. 3 against 1 at night on empty ground with weapons and intent. This wasn't an oppose T a diner. This wasn't an oppose T a man and oppose. Wounded ego looking for an exit ramp. These men had planned this. They had hunted her. The promise she and oppose, Dee made herself 11 years ago, give every fight the chance to walk away first, had just run out of runway. She climbed down from the cab. End quote. 3 against 1. End quote. Cole called, his voice bouncing off the corrugated steel walls, trying to sound like the man he and oppose. Dee been in the cage and not quite landing it. End quote. No rain to hide behind this time. End quote. Renata didn't and oppose T answer. She walked to the front of her rig into the wash of her own headlights, and lowered her stance slightly, hands loose at her sides, eyes moving between the three of them in a slow, practiced sweep, reading hands, reading feet, reading who would move first. It was Marcus, eager to prove himself, who swung the flashlight first. Renata stepped into the swing instead of away from it, catching the forearm and driving the heel of her palm up under his jaw in one motion. The crack of impact echoed off the steel around them, and Marcus dropped, unconscious before he hit the ground. Total time 2 seconds. Tyler froze. He looked at Marcus, out cold on the concrete, then at Renata, whose breathing hadn't and oppose. T even changed and something in him simply gave out. End quote. I and oppose am out. End quote. He said, dropping his flashlight, backing away with both hands raised. End quote. I and oppose am out. I don't and oppose. T want this. End quote. End quote. Coward. End quote. Cole snarled and charged. Not a technique now, just raw fear dressed up as rage, a wild overhand right thrown with everything he had left. Renata slipped off the center line and drove her forearm up into the path of his fist. His knuckles met bone instead of jaw, and the crack that followed wasn't and oppose. T hers, 2 metacarpals in his right hand shattered on impact, and Cole screamed, cradling the ruined hand against his chest as she caught the back of his neck and drove a knee into his solar plexus, folding him to the ground, gasping, empty of air and empty finally of every illusion he and oppose. Dee walked in with. She held him there, one hand still on the back of his neck, her voice low and even in his ear. End quote. You hunted someone you don and oppose. Tino. End quote, she said. End quote. In the dark with weapons 3 against 1. That wasn't an oppose T a rematch. That was an ambush. And it was the worst decision you and oppose V made in your life. End quote. That was when the sirens hit. Red and blue light sweeping the corrugated walls as 2 Lubbock PD cruisers came around the corner and boxed in the Raptor. End quote. Hands where I can see them. Everybody freeze. End quote. Cole on his knees in the gravel felt something close to relief. The police were here, he was the one bleeding, well Marcus was the one bleeding. And his hand was broken, and this woman had just put 3 men on the ground in under a minute. He was the victim now. That was the story he was going to tell. And he started telling it before the first officer had even reached them. End quote. Officer, arrest her, she attacked us, she nearly killed my friend. End quote. A woman in a captain and oppose uniform stepped through the light, weapon lowered, moving toward the scene with the unhurried authority of someone who and oppose. Dee worked this county for 25 years. Captain Elena Vasquez took in the unconscious man on the ground, the kneeling, broken figure of Cole Whitfield, and finally the woman standing calmly in the headlights with her hands raised, and stopped walking. Her face changed. End quote, Sergeant Cruz, end quote, she said, and there was something in her voice that didn't end oppose. T belong at a midnight brawl outside a steel yard, something like reverence. She lowered her weapon fully and closed the distance, hand extended. End quote, it and oppose. S been a long time. End quote. Cole and oppose. S stomach dropped through the wet gravel. End quote, Sergeant. End quote. Renata lowered her hands, the tension finally leaving her shoulders in a long breath. End quote, Vasquez, end quote, she said, recognition warming her voice by a degree. End quote, you made captain. Good, end quote. End quote. 4th Recon attached us to a joint task force outside Fallujah in 06, end quote. Vasquez said, turning to her officers without letting go of Renata and Apos' hand yet. End quote. My brother was pinned down with his squad for 6 hours in a building that shouldn't Apos' have been cleared. Sergeant Cruz and Apos' team went back in for them. Twice. End quote. She looked at Renata. End quote. He made it home. Made it to his kid and Apos' graduation last spring. I never got the chance to thank you properly. End quote. End quote. Your brother made it home because he didn't and Apos' panic, end quote, Renata said. End quote, that and Apos' on him, not me. End quote. Cole, still on his knees, felt the ground of his own narrative disappear beneath him. End quote, I don't and Apos' care who she is, end quote, he said, though his voice had lost most of its conviction. End quote, look at my hand. Look at Marcus, end quote. Vasquez turned to him, and whatever warmth had been in her face for Renata was gone entirely. End quote. I know exactly who you are, Mr. Whitfield, end quote, she said. End quote. Everybody in 3 counties knows your record. What I didn't and Apos' know until about 30 seconds ago, is that you tracked down and ambushed a decorated Force Recon Marine, 6 years overseas, a Bronze Star with Combat V, and a habit of pulling people out of buildings other units had already written off in the dark with 2 friends and a set of flashlights. End quote. She shook her head slowly. End quote. You brought a training partner and a flashlight to a fight with someone who used to do this professionally, against people a great deal more dangerous than you, and got paid by the United States government to win. End quote. The words landed harder than anything that had happened in the parking lot. End quote. She assaulted us, end quote. Cole tried again, but it came out smaller this time. Renata walked to the front of her rig and tapped the small black square mounted near her windshield. End quote. Dash cam, end quote, she said. End quote. Night vision audio. It and Apos' got your truck cutting me off, all 3 of you exiting with weapons, and you announcing exactly what you intended to do to me. Texas law gives me a lot more room than you and Apos' like to think in a situation like that. You should be grateful I decided to put you on the ground instead of doing something you wouldn't and Apos' get back up from. End quote. Vasquez was already gesturing her officers forward. End quote. Cuff him. Get an ambulance for the one who and Apos' still out. Read them their rights and get that raptor towed. It and Apos' evidence now, end quote. As the cuffs closed around his uninjured wrist, Cole looked back once at Renata, who wasn't and Apos' gloating, wasn't and Apos' even looking at him anymore. She was checking the front bumper of her truck for damage, her mind already sliding back toward the 400 miles of steel pipe she still had to deliver. He wasn't an Apos' a defeated enemy to her. He was a delay in the schedule. That indifference did more damage to him than the broken hand ever would. The wind outside Pecos had a way of scraping every surface bare, and by late spring it had scraped a great deal off Cole Whitfield. He and Apos' lost close to 20 pounds, most of it muscle he could no longer maintain without full use of his right hand. A jagged surgical scar ran from his knuckles to his wrist, tracking the plates and screws holding his hand together. The criminal case, aggravated assault, conspiracy, reckless endangerment, had very nearly ended in prison time. It was Renata and Apos' own refusal to push for the maximum penalty, offered in a brief, unsentimental letter to the DA, that had let him plead down to a misdemeanor with probation and several hundred hours of community service. He didn't and Apos' know why she and Apos' Dee done it, and for a long time he was too ashamed to ask. The public fallout hadn't an oppose. T needed her help. Tyler, released without charges, had talked first to a few people at the gym, then inevitably to everyone. The story of the undefeated Cole Whitfield getting dropped twice by a 51-year-old female trucker spread through the regional MMA scene fast enough to outrun any correction he tried to offer. His sponsors dropped him within a month. Membership at Whitfield MMA cratered. He sold the gym in March, mostly to cover legal fees, and kept only the lease on a small community center annex nobody else had wanted. He was sitting in a diner outside Pecos on a Tuesday afternoon, nursing black coffee with his left hand, when the bell over the door rang and Renata Cruz walked in. She looked exactly the same. Faded jacket, worn boots, the same trident pin on her keys. She paused when she saw him, and for half a second something in her stance shifted. A fast, automatic read of his hands, his posture, the exits, before she recognized there was no threat here, just a young man who looked considerably smaller than he had the last two times she and Oppos Dee seen him. He raised his good hand in an awkward, uncertain greeting. She walked over and slid into the booth across from him without being asked. And quote, "You and Oppos V got some nerve tracking my route," and quote, she said, but there was no real edge in it. And quote, "I didn't and Oppos T hack anything. Reina got fired for pulling your manifest the first time. I wouldn't and Oppos T do that to her twice." And quote, he turned the coffee cup slowly on the table. And quote, "I and Oppos V just been sitting at truck stops on your usual corridor for about 3 weeks. Hoping." And quote, "Why?" And quote, he took a breath. And quote, "Doctors say I won and Oppos T get full grip strength back. No more kimuras, no rear naked chokes, nothing that needs real torque through this hand. My career and Oppos S done." And quote, Renata didn't and Oppos T offer sympathy, she didn't and Oppos T feel. And quote, "Actions have consequences. You rolled the dice in the dark and you lost." And quote, "I know." And quote, he looked up, and this time he didn't and Oppos T look away from her the way he had in the steel yard. And quote, "I and Oppos am not here to complain. I and Oppos am here to say thank you." And quote, her brow lifted slightly. And quote, "For breaking your hand." And quote, "For not killing me. For not letting the bury me either when you could have." And quote, he set the cup down. And quote, "I and Oppos V had 4 months to think about what kind of person goes hunting someone at 1 in the morning with 2 friends and a set of flashlights because a stranger didn't and Oppos T flinch when he wanted her to. I was out of control. I built a whole life around making sure nobody ever looked past me again. And the first time somebody did, I decided the answer was violence." And quote, he shook his head. And quote, "If it had been anyone else in that truck, anyone with less restraint or a gun instead of a knee to the ribs, I and Oppos D either be dead or I and Oppos D have killed someone and be in prison right now instead of sitting in a diner complaining about my hand." And quote, Renata studied him for a long moment, and the flat, assessing look she and Oppos D given him in the diner 4 months ago had softened into something closer to appraisal, the look of someone deciding whether a person was actually changing or just performing change for an audience of one. And quote, "Martial arts wasn't and Oppos T built to make predators." And quote, she said finally. And quote, "It was built to give people discipline, and to protect the ones who couldn't and Oppos T protect themselves. You had all the tools and none of the reason. That and Oppos S not your fault entirely. Somebody should have taught you the difference a long time before I did. But it is your problem to fix now." And quote, "I know." And quote, he hesitated, then reached into his jacket with his good hand and pulled out a folded printout, a flyer for a youth wrestling program at the community center, his name listed as the volunteer coach. And quote, "I sold the gym. Used most of it for restitution and legal fees. Kept the lease on the annex. I and Oppos am teaching kids wrestling twice a week, the actual sport, discipline, rules, the whole point of it, and trying to talk to them about the rest." And quote, "Keep doing that." And quote, she reached across the table and offered her hand. Cole took it with his scarred right one, the grip weaker than it used to be but steady, and meant. And quote, "Good luck, Cole." And quote, Renata said. She stood, left a few dollars for her coffee, and walked out into the afternoon light. Through the window, Cole watched her climb into her rig, the big diesel engine turning over with a sound like a held breath finally let go, and pull out onto the highway, shrinking into the flat gold distance of the plains until she was gone. He sat there a while longer with his cold coffee, turning the flyer over in his hands. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't undefeated. He was better than that. He was honest.